Wonderful. Everyone, thank you for joining us on Cyber Judo tonight. Really appreciate everybody's time. Tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about the fundamentals in web application penetration testing. We have quite the house with us today. We have not just myself, Christian Scott, our host, but my illustrious co-host, Travis DeForge. We also have very frequent participants, Michael Hallman, Dennis Carlson, and Avery Vaughn. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is jumping into more specifically, beyond the fundamentals of web application pen testing, some of the tools, the techniques, some of the tips and tricks that our team likes to employ when we're engaging in real web application pen testing. It's something that our firm in our day jobs at Gotham Security, we do every single day in and day out across small applications, enterprise applications, not just web applications that are very standard static sites, but also single page applications that are dynamic and complex. Some web applications that employ a various web of APIs that can be a bit difficult to reverse engineer sometimes and figure out the details of all that kind of stuff. So what we wanted to do tonight was start to build on some of the foundation and fundamentals for people who are looking to break into web application pen testing or who have already started the process of learning about web application pen testing and are trying to build their skill levels up. So that being noted, tonight, what I want to do is I want to jump into a little bit about your background, Michael, because you have a very, I would say, conventional approach to breaking into cybersecurity. You initially started from a background of somebody who was not necessarily, quote unquote, like a IT career person. You came, I believe, from the healthcare industry. I believe actually previously a phlebotomist. Am I right?
You're correct. Yeah.
Okay. And then, so you've been building out your skills, your expertise, your knowledge. You did a lot of CTFs and all that kind of stuff. And you today do a lot of web app pen testing here at Gotham Security. So first and foremost, Hallman, why don't you talk a little bit about specifically some of the techniques, some of the things that you've been learning about web app pen testing to help land you a job, I know originally at SPI and then here at Gotham Security.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So with web app pen testing, I start off basically like how Christian said from the ground up, not knowing much about penetration testing at all, right? So I went the conventional route of try hack me, CTFs, things of that nature. Kind of sat under a bunch of learning trees with a bunch of guys that did web challenges on the CTF.
Mm-hmm.
So it was web chows all over the place. Self taught really by reading the web hackers, handbook guide. That is an excellent guide to get started with. As far as web app testing, I would say what I learned most on was Portswigger, and that's gives you a bunch of labs, a bunch of different fundamentals of the beginning bare bones of a ton of different web vulnerabilities, the ability to like run with them with Burp Suite, check out vulnerabilities, things of that nature, and to this day, I think I'm still extremely fascinated by it and learning with it. But I would say try hack me, the web-based pathways, and Portswigger is really where I first got my start with web applications. So that's
Okay.
that would be an excellent spot for somebody new starting, because it goes into the detail of the Portswigger Academy. It gives you all the courses, it tells you what the vulnerabilities are, and it kind of guides you step by step on how to go about solving these things. And I say solving, but more like finding the vulnerabilities, right? So it uses a lot of real world stuff as opposed to some CTFE things can be, as we call it, CTFE, right? So in the Portswigger labs, super important to know how to start from a bare bones, to work your way up, not just to go in and try to find huge exploits right away, because that's hardly the case anyhow when we're testing web apps. We often find like the smaller things, and Portswigger does an excellent job at giving you those foundational learning paths. So
Awesome. Now, you went almost straight into web app pen testing compared to conventional network pen testing, which I find a bit interesting. So, again, you kind of did, like a lot of folks, and again, in cybersecurity, they're breaking into cybersecurity, they'll usually kind of pursue like an initial role as like a SOC analyst, usually something kind of like a little bit more on the blue team side. Then they'll build up their expertise and knowledge. Then they'll get kind of into the red teaming side, but they'll usually start with network pen testing. and then get into web apps, right? So kind of slowly matriculating the amount of knowledge, expertise, complexity of what they're working on. But you just did like a double hop there. But I know that Travis, in your particular background, working with us for approximately 3 years now, we started you out on network pen testing. And you've been getting your hands quite a bit deeper into web application pen testing. And I'm certain that there's a lot of people who can kind of relate to that, where they've gone through the ins and outs of conventional network pen testing. They're very fluent in it. They feel very comfortable in that domain. But then as they start to break into web app pen testing, they realize it's this whole nother beast.
It's totally different.
I was about to say, so can you talk a little bit about some of the major differences between network pen testing and web app pen testing to kind of help set people up with good expectations as they grow in that domain?
Other than the ethical methodology, at first you get the lay of the land and you start to poke around passive, you go to active and you start to do some exploits that are safe and don't impact the CIA and all that. There aren't a lot of similarities, really. I mean, the set of tooling is totally different. The size and scope of what you're doing is dramatically different. I mean, there's the playbook when you're dealing with a couple /16s on a network versus you're dealing with one really intricate app with 8 different user roles and 10 dozens of different API calls. It's a completely different animal. Even the language you have to use to describe the vulnerabilities, to describe the remediation, it's a completely different language from network. I mean, it's not to say that you can't learn it, you can't jump over to it, but it is definitely something that is very, very different. If you spend a lot of time working through, getting really comfortable with the fundamentals of Active Directory and things, maybe like Cisco infrastructure and traditional networking infrastructure, you may be very well apt to do an internal or external network pen test, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're equipped for a OWASP standard or a high quality, very intricate web application. It's just a different skill set.
Yeah, in fact, if I can interject here, Travis, I would absolutely agree. I think that some of the biggest differences, people like to compare the different aspects of it. Right? They like to compare mobile testing or API testing and web pen testing. But if I had to go up against, network and web app, they are completely different. I would say, in network pen testing, you're going to see something like configuration issues, right? On network issues, you're going to see things like a misconfiguration of services, misconfigurations of systems. You're going to see, general configuration problems. With web apps, on the other hand, while you can still see that, the large majority of those issues are probably going to be logic issues or implementation issues in the actual design of the software. So it's absolutely different. I completely agree with you, not only in tooling, but also in methodology on how you're going to approach the testing.
Well, what's interesting is when you do a lot of the network pen tests, one of the things that you'll see all the time, and it's an eye roll every time, not just for you, but for the client too, but when there's default credentials. And one of the things I was a little bit surprised at when we got to web apps is they're kind of still there. They're just called something different. Now they're called hard-coded credentials, but it's it's still kind of the a little bit of an eye roll when it happens. But no, you're absolutely right.
What about secrets?
API keys.
Secrets. I know. No one ever talks about hard-coded secrets in network pen tests. That's only something special for the web apps. You guys have showed me that.
We should push the secret searcher tools here as a perfect plug for it.
Yeah. I've never heard you guys say that. Oh, we found secrets. It's
100%. By the way, my apologies for dropping there. I'm going to presume that Dennis, you hit me with a ping of death or something like that, and my internet dropped out there for a second.
I
like your style, smart guy.
I couldn't get a word in if I didn't knock you off the meeting. I just.
So you guys were talking just a little bit about, so Travis, you were just wrapping up with talking about network pen testing. And then were you hitting it a little bit of some of the less known unconventional vulnerabilities that we kind of tend to see in web apps?
Oh, just a little bit of a compare and contrast between how different they are. And then I was comparing, having default creds all over the place for network equipment versus having hard-coded credentials. They're the thing that strikes me as being kind of similar, but otherwise there's not a lot that's quite a simulacrum.
Yeah. With web apps, there's also server disclosure too. So you find the information,
Right.
like the versions and things like that, and then all of a sudden, oh, hey, they're running, this server. Let's see if they have default credentials as well. So it tends to be similar in that aspect. Network and web share that similarity.
Everything does start to blend into itself, though, once you're able to find various injection or remote code execution vulnerabilities within a web application that then allows you to gain a foothold into the underlying web server infrastructure or database infrastructure, right? Because then after that, right, then you get back into network pen testing, right? You're following more like PTES rather than like, OWASP Web Security Testing Guide, right? And then you go through a more conventional kill chain of the gaining persistence, performing privilege escalation, performing lateral movement, that kind of stuff. But to that, so a lot of people, they hear about web app pen testing. They've heard about like SQL injection, cross-site request forgery attacks, cross-site scripting attacks. Like almost everyone hears about them. They know like, yeah, they're important, especially by the way, with like the move it vulnerability just recently that's been like in the news everywhere for like the last month because it was a fairly straightforward SQL injection attack vector, right? But I do kind of always find it interesting about some of the less conventionally discussed vulnerabilities that we tend to encounter in our day-to-day lives as web app pen testers and whatnot. Things like, I've heard the team talk about a lot of like IDOR vulnerabilities and being able to exploit those, XML entity injection attacks, that kind of stuff. Dennis, what are some of the more unconventional attack vectors or vulnerabilities that maybe you tend to see or that you're aware of that maybe should have a little bit more attention behind them or people should pay a little bit more a closer inspection to?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that actually for the Move It file transfer vulnerability. Actually, one that came to mind is the second stage of that exploit. So the first stage obviously is SQL injection, but the second stage, which I think is really neat, is the type confusion delegate exploit that they actually go ahead and leverage in this situation. So essentially, for those who aren't familiar, a type confusion delegate is when you basically set it up to where you are passing a value, right, to like an ASP application. And what happens is the type isn't checked correctly. And so as a result, it actually gains code execution. That is a really neat, really severe vulnerability if it's able to actually be leveraged. And it's not commonly discussed. It's very, at the same time, it's very like Windows specific, right? Because, you're focusing on like some sort of like .NET web application. It's very, very Windows specific, but at the same time, it is very, very strong if you can get a hold of some kind of exploit that leverages that. That's the one that comes to mind most prevalent because just a lot of people don't think about that. At the same time, there is a level of I don't want to say expertise, more a nuance to it. There's a level of nuance to it in order to actually execute these attacks. That's one that definitely comes to mind as far as being very obscure and, some not used incredibly often. More generally, yeah, IDOR vulnerabilities. People don't talk about IDOR a whole lot, but IDOR is very, very common. Like if I had to go over, what I see most often in pen testing web applications, I would say that IDOR is an incredibly common issue. And it's an easy thing to test for as well. But at the same time, it's just, a lot of IDOR exploitation comes from older code that has been, updated and, patched to potentially fix security issues. But in the process of maintaining this older legacy code and bringing it forward, you can sometimes introduce these sorts of issues where, you may fix it up here, but then you didn't check the access control, as you're accessing this object. And therefore, you run into an IDOR vulnerability. That's why as well, I would say in regards to OWASP cheat sheet, one of the big recommendations that they have on the OWASP cheat sheet for for authorization is to enforce authorization everywhere. If you enforce authorization on a global application scale, like if you're doing like a Flask application, if you're familiar with Python Flask, you can basically set up authentication for certain endpoints, or you can set it up across the entire application. If you set it up in a general way that covers pretty much everything, you don't have to worry about missing potentially an exploit. That's why it's important to ensure that authentication is enforced everywhere, and if possible, consider enforcing authentication at a global level, so you don't just miss one endpoint and then oops, you accidentally dumped confidential client data. But those are the two that I think of that come to mind for me.
So very good point there. So the one that I find very interesting that I don't really hear as many pen testers talk about, and I feel like a lot of times people kind of like briefly just kind of glaze over, our cores misconfigurations. So it's for cross-origin resources, right? And being able to define what type of resources or what type of sites can access those resources in other domains. And the biggest example that I think that demonstrates how core vulnerabilities could be really, really problematic actually was with Amazon Alexa. So over permissive cores may allow other sites to essentially access whatever API or resources that you have loaded for your particular site or your API backend, that kind of stuff. And in this particular instance, this was a couple of years back now, the folks at Checkpoint, they happened to find that there was a major cores vulnerability in Amazon, in the Amazon APIs and in Amazon Alexa, where what it would allow potentially a malicious actor to do is create a fraudulent site that once our user went to through some type of social engineering attack vector, that cross-origin resource site request would then be able to access essentially some of the Alexa APIs. And so a malicious actor could then delete or create or access various skills or various information about like someone's recent Alexa history commands, all that kind of stuff. Now, they're really quick to patch it, but I just found that was something that was really intriguing or interesting that went under the radar, especially for obviously such a large organization that I'm certain they take cybersecurity very, very seriously and have, security controls baked into almost every element of their software development lifecycle.
Christian, can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah.
So I know the answer now because I get to work with all of you gentlemen, but I think maybe you guys should explain what the difference between a web app and an API is, because I think sometimes those get confused and there might not, sometimes that can be a confusing thing. So maybe if you guys could give a quick
Holman, you've had the opportunity of doing a lot of web app pen testing, right? And you're now just in the initial bits of getting into APIs. So you're actually in the precipice of doing that discovery and learning about it. Why don't you give that quick breakdown for our audience?
Because sometimes people use them like interchangeably. You're on, Holman. Tell us what you got. Because I don't know.
Yeah. No. So there's APIs are there's categories of different types. There's like RESTful, there's GraphQL, as long as that with like Christian said, and I'm very much in the beginning phases of learning APIs. I'm in that phase now of like playing around with Postman requests, things of that nature. So when you break it down, API and web app are entirely similar about 90% of the way, because all it is just API testing is web app testing, but without the fun fancy GUIs, right? You're testing out requests the entire time as opposed to actually being on a web application. That's the main difference on an extreme low level bird's eye view of that. As far as the differences between higher nuances, I would defer for Dennis to those because I'm still kind of learning, but that's the basic of it, if from a low level standpoint with API versus web app.
Good. Cool. I'm glad my guess was correct after reading all the.
You are very much correct. Yeah.
I'm glad after reading all of the reports you guys write that are amazing. I gathered the right information.
Simple way to think of it, if you're really unfamiliar with it, is web app is something like in your browser you can interact with, right? You can do something that it's got a GUI. The API is for machine to machine coordination in calls, right? So
Exactly.
whatever is on the back end of that application, that GUI that you are interacting with as a human with a mouse, that call, that back end connection is the API, the application programming interface. It gets that information from the service, the web services that are downstream, or what the database calls, or whatever it's doing, and bringing that back to web application to keep you going forward in your workflow. So the main difference, like Michael was saying, is one of them you've got the GUI, you can see what's going on the screen. The API one, it's all going to be in Burp Suite or Postman. It's all going to be just those server calls.
And I think that's a perfect point into one of the elements that I think I was briefly hitting on maybe last week or the week before, which is there are some certain things that when folks are doing pen testing that are like little misnomers that kind of annoy me that I'll see in other pen testers reports. So they'll be like, hey, you don't have an X-frame options header, on this API to prevent clickjacking attacks. It's like, okay, well, clickjacking attacks are primarily to be used against the user of the web application, right? That's in combination of a social engineering attack, right? Where you're overlaying HTML elements over a legitimate website that's embedded in an iframe. You're stealing somebody's credentials through invisible login forms, all that kind of stuff. But with an API, human beings don't use it. It's machine to machine. So you could have an X-frame options header if you wanted in your responses on your APIs, but it makes your APIs kind of a bit fatter in their responses, and it's kind of superfluous. So if you want to do it for optics, you can be my guest, but it's not a significant thing. Beyond that, Dennis, did we miss any big elements that you want to hit on in regards to breaking down the major differences between APIs and web apps, and maybe some of the nuances pen testers should really focus on when there's a difference between them?
So yeah, so I would actually I would concur with Michael's point as well. There are large similarities between there are large similarities between web apps and APIs. To be entirely honest with you, I think one of the bigger things that is sometimes intimidating to new users who are maybe testing these web apps or these APIs is they may think that they're, number one, they're incredibly different, but I don't think that that's what it is. I think the real problem that you may run into is when you're testing an API, what you find yourself with is that you don't have an example to work off of, right? When you're testing web apps, one of the really nice things about testing web apps is that you get basically an example application. You get something that shows you how the interaction works between the back end and the front end.
Because you're going through the user workflows and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. My headphones just went out. Give me 1 second. I'll throw it back to you, Christian.
Okay, so basically, because one is going through the user workflows within the web interface, the web interface is just rendered by client-side code, right? It allows the pen tester to infer a little bit about the client-server communications that would occur with the back end. And when you just get a dry API, you really don't have much insight. And maybe you have to do things like what we call fuzzing, which is basically, guessing at what type of endpoints might exist, what type of parameters those endpoints might, accept, and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, really, when you go to start to do API pen testing, it's always really helpful to have the entire schema together in something like a Postman collection. So usually if we're doing, like our firm is doing API pen testing strictly, rather than a web app, we would ask for something like a Postman collection. Dennis, exactly. Your headphones are good to go now?
Headphones are good, yes. Yeah, exactly that. To finish the thought, yes. Web apps, you get a nice example application, gives you an idea of how it interacts, what the endpoints are used for. With APIs, you may not have that. In some cases, documentation is hard. Some cases, documentation may be incomplete, or it may, in some cases, may not exist at all.
Some cases?
In a lot of cases it's incomplete. In some cases it's not at all. But I think that's the big challenge with APIs versus web apps is you need to have some kind of reference for it. And to your point, you sometimes you have to kind of fuzz it a little bit, guess what some of the values are used for and play around with it some.
So continuing here a little bit. So I know, Holman, you hit on Burp Suite. Hey, primary tool. I would say that's like your number one tool as a web app pen tester, right?
Oh, yeah, easily.
And then obviously their training content. Travis, what are some additional tools that you would suggest? Like your top, like let's say 1 to 3 tools that should accompany Burp Suite for web app pen testers? Or what are your go-tos?
It's not an individual tool, but it's real hard to do it without Python installed, because there are tons of Burp Suite Pro plugins. A lot of those plugins, there are alternative tools that can do it, and we've seen some plugins work really, really great. Some things are better open source alternatives that are just free out there in Python, like the Burp Suite SSL checker. We've had some really sketchy results out of that one. Sometimes it looks like it's spot on. Sometimes it changes every 4 or 5 minutes on the same application. So definitely making sure you have, if you are using a lot of those other plugins beyond the proxying function, to make sure you have another tool there to corroborate your evidence, right? Like I wouldn't only rely on the log4j Burp Suite checker, right? You'd want to have another corroborating tool for that as well.
You make a really good point bringing up the Burp Suite plugins, by the way, because that's one thing that a lot of people, they'll beat their head against the wall all day long doing a lot of manual stuff in Burp Suite, not realizing that they can make their lives easier with a couple
of them are awesome, and some of them are totally useless.
You got 1 or 2 that you like to use, Travis, that you want to call on?
The JWT checker one is really good. I like that one. It decodes it pretty quickly. It lets you automate like the nil algorithm attacks. That one's a good one. It's a little bit better than using it in decoder because it's just faster.
Yeah.
That's one that comes to mind immediately.
Allman, what's your favorite?
I think for me, my favorite tool is something that's a little bit unconventional because I love XML injection, XXE injection, things like that. So I use something called Content Converter. And what that does is it converts your JSON into XML and vice versa, XML into JSON. So it allows you to kind of see if there's any XXE vulnerabilities that might not be there on the surface. You can actually convert your JSON into XML, and then it kind of goes through it from there. That's like one of those niche tools, though, and that's one that I like using. The JS Miner is kind of okay. It's the same thing like Travis is saying, that sometimes you get weird nuanced things when you're not using like Python built-in scans. I prefer our in-house tools, that we use for secrets, like Secret Searcher, Mystic, things like that. But no, that's if I was to put my hand on one that I think is really unique and different, is definitely Content Converter.
So the most challenging thing for me when I've done web app pen testing is working with GraphQL stuff. GraphQL is just a whole nother layer of like a newer set of technologies and ways to interface with backend infrastructure systems and data structures. And when I first got into GraphQL pen testing, I was doing everything absolutely as manually as possible in trying to do introspection, map out the GraphQL schema and whatnot. And then someone on our team was like, dude, why aren't you using something like InQL, the Burp Suite plugin, InQL? I was like, oh my God. And so that's a huge one I would recommend for anyone who has to go through the guffaws of doing any web app pen testing against a backend that's going to have GraphQL. And then also another really big one, if you're working with GraphQL, is GraphQL Voyager, which will help actually visualize and diagram out the entire structure of all the requests and the data types you're working with. This way it gives the opportunity to visualize and understand, where are there opportunities of being able to exploit unintentional disclosure of information, that kind of stuff. Dennis, what do you got in mind?
And why is it Cyber Chef?
Oh, no. So funny enough, Cyber Chef was one of them, but that's a tool I recommend. But for Burp Suite specifically, PwnFox. I love PwnFox. Using PwnFox makes it so much easier. Oh yeah, you can containerize it, so you can open one tab and test an application in one account. You can open a separate tab, same browser, with PwnFox, and you can test a completely different login. You can have side by side on there. You can have color coding. So if you load the PwnFox plugin through Burp, color codes it automatically. Makes it really easy to differentiate which request is which. It's just a real nicety. But yeah, to your point, Travis, Cyber Chef was the fallback there.
Yeah. If I can interject real quick on the PwnFox thing, what's great about that is we already talked about IDOR, right? The insecure direct object reference. There's MFLAG, the missing function level access control. And what Dennis has brought up, this amazing tool, is it allows you to have containerized running at the same time. So you can be logged in as user 1 on Burp and then log in as user 2, and it allows you to test these IDORs and these MFLAGs a lot better, right? Instead of like having to log in and out and capture requests, you can do it simultaneously, which is why this is a great tool Dennis brought up. It's fantastic. So.
Nice. Next level. So I'm going to briefly just bring that up so everyone can see it here. Travis will also drop that one in LinkedIn. That sounds like a must have 100%. That being said, I am going to pull this one back up here. So Cameron asks, what is the most difficult thing to learn in web app pen testing? Wowee. Okay, for me, I think I do not consider myself by any means close to an expert in web app pen testing or anything like that. And so likely I haven't even gone down 50% of the iceberg. But I think GraphQL was probably one of the most challenging ones for me personally picking up and learning. Travis, what's been the hardest thing with web app pen testing so far to learn?
For me, it was the interactions with the APIs and understanding on each engagement by engagement basis which API endpoints are intended to be in scope, which ones are third-party endpoints, and where does the engagement start and end. That isn't always as clear as you think it would be. And you can waste a whole lot of time, and you can spiral out of scope really quickly if you don't really get that one. So that was challenging for me at first.
And that's a bit of a gut thing, like an experience thing. That is not something necessarily you read from a book. So that's a lot of practice and kind of going through not just labs and training, but also having to just see a little bit of real world apps. That's a good one. Dennis, hardest thing with web app pen testing that you've learned so far?
So so first off, Travis's point, really good. It is very, very easy to go out of scope on some of these web applications depending on where the lines are drawn. So great point there. If I had to give one for me personally, I think some of the more advanced exploits, there are some quite advanced exploits that are a little difficult to kind of pull off and wrap your head around how they function, especially when there's multiple different ways that the exploits can function. So if I can give an example, request smuggling is a little bit of a harder one to get a grip on just because there's so many ways that you can do it and there's so many intricacies as well. It's a little bit of a complex exploit to actually go through and demonstrate it. It's been around forever from my understanding, but at the same time there's just so many nuances to it,
And it requires an inherent understanding as you're working with that web application, some of the defense and depth measures it may have or be lacking, where it is implicitly trusting other components of the web app or database or middleware components. So yeah,
exactly. And you have to know the infrastructure as well. Depending on how you want it to work out, you may have to have an understanding of what systems are in the way.
That's a very good point. Michael, hardest thing to learn in web app pen testing so far?
I think for me, Dennis kind of stole the request smuggling from me because I'm a huge James Kettle fan. So I've watched that whole series unfold for the last 3 or 4 years on it. For me, starting off learning, I am not a developer. I didn't have a background in coding. Yeah. So as far as learning web apps, it's not paramount, but for me, it was difficult seeing code for the first time, really, and figuring out what I needed to pull from that and break it and bust it. Like JavaScript in particular, you're like, where do you throw in your cross-site scriptings? How do you escape script tags? How do you escape quotes for SQL? All those things as a non-developer was super difficult, something that I am continuing working on now with getting more exposure to coding itself. Not that you can't test web apps when you don't have a dev background, that's not the case. It just helps when you are able to understand what's actually happening underneath the hood. So
very good.
Yep.
By the way, if anyone's wondering, when it comes to really good hard hitters like that, and also what Dennis was hitting on a little bit as for wrapping your head around the more advanced exploits, Payload All the Things has a really great way of, I think, they have a lot of good cheat sheets, guides, instructional content that allows you to take components of your knowledge of web app vulnerabilities and being able to exploit something and then really traverse that into a remote code execution attack that then lands you a foothold on server infrastructure. So certainly I call that one out. That's a really a big one there. So all noted. I believe we have one other really fantastic question. Let me pull this up here in the chat. And I believe this is from our boy Ryan. Okay, so from your perspectives, would you consider coding to be foundations required for being successful at web app pen testing? So network stuff, no. Web app, I was saying this actually to my team the other day that our customers don't expect us to rip apart a web application and tell them everything that's wrong about it. That's not what they want from us. That's not what customers purchase from us. Customers are purchasing from our team the experience and the expertise that comes along with architecting a secure web application. And all we're doing is we're illustrating how to architect a secure application by demonstrating what an insecure application looks like and providing a practical impact behind it, which means that if let's say you go through a path of doing web app pen testing, not learning coding, you're going to have a really difficult time explaining the why behind, these security controls are being implemented, the why behind this, why that attack works, right? Which means that you're always going to be foundationally, I think, against the surface vulnerabilities, all the low hanging fruit. But when it comes to really getting into the nuts and bolts of being a good, let's say, cybersecurity architect, you'll never be able to really get there. So I do think a foundation, at least in not just Python, is really important. That foundations in I'd say by minimally JavaScript as well. Obviously, HTML comes with the territory and that kind of stuff. And then also, I think some of the data structures that people tend to work with. So XML and JSON, they're not programming languages, right? Those are data structures. So there's ways you represent, a lot of data like a spreadsheet and that kind of stuff, right? You have to have a really good understanding of what XML is and what JSON is and why they're different and how vulnerabilities could be introduced to those different data structures. Is there anyone who, by the way, disagrees with me? Like, hey, you could be a fantastic web app pen tester without any coding skills.
Absolutely not. No, it's so much easier. You can say, oh, I found this SQLI injection, right? Or this SQLI, and you replicate the steps, but then you don't talk about, how you can remediate that. Do you know about parameterized queries, right? Can you explain those things well? Cross-site scripting. Can you say, oh, are you using URL encoding? Are you escaping HTML? Are you using a content security policy? Like, all these things you have to know in your head as a good security architect, because if you're just presenting, oh, this is how we did this, that's not what they paid for. They could get that from any Joe Schmo. They pay for the personalization, the customization of their web app, right? You have to know how to fix these vulnerabilities, and coding is the bare bones start of it. And I'll say for myself, again, I don't have a dev background, but I damn sure am learning how to do all these things, because you want to be validated. You don't want to be the non-expert, because customers can sniff that. Why do we hire you then? You're just going to show us this but not show us how to fix this. Then it's a huge problem. And I think you have to go in with an open mind that you need to at least not write something sophisticated, but at least understand how it's working. Being able to look at the code and say, hey, this is what it's trying to accomplish. This is how to break it. This is how to fix it. Can I write something sophisticated yet? No. Will I get there? Maybe, but I can understand what's going on and then explain it. And that's a huge part of being in web app. You have to be super confident of what you're talking about, because there's so many different fixes too, as well.
Yeah. I know, Avery, you brought up just a little bit earlier, talking about hard-coded credentials and secrets and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we actually see all the time when we go to do a web app pen test is somebody having hard-coded secrets in client-side code. And a lot of times, other pen testers and automated web app pen testing tools and all that kind of stuff, they don't pick that stuff up. Right, it really requires a bit of kind of going through the source files of what's being loaded in the web browser and kind of scrolling through it and kind of wrapping your brains around it. And I know, Dennis, that's why one of the reasons why you and Shane created Secret Scanner and Secret Searcher. By the way, Dennis, you got a new version of Secret Searcher. What's it called again?
Mystic. So Mystic. Yes. So absolutely.
Is that released yet? Open to the public?
Not entirely, not yet, but it's still in testing. But I will say, I have leveraged this, and I'm trying to refine it to a point where it is, if I can go into one of the issues, the big issue I see with Secret Searcher is just that it gives you a lot of hits, right? And then you got to scan through those hits, and it's just it's a pain to sort through. The idea with Mystic is that I'm trying to reduce it down to a point where we can get a nice rating system, so it can just say this is more likely or less likely. Now, it's not going to do the work for you. I mean, obviously, it still requires a human eye, but at the same time, it makes it way easier to sort through. And I think that's one of the big benefits. But if I can give an analogy to the whole, being a developer and working on web app testing or just web app testing, I would say it's kind of like if you were a trucker, right? You're trucking, that's your job. You would probably be quite an efficient trucker if you also were a mechanic at the same time. If something goes wrong, you know why it goes wrong. You can recommend how to fix it or fix it yourself,
Mm-hmm.
So it's knowing how the systems work and being able to drive the truck. I think I would think it gives quite a bit of insight into the resolution of the issue and also the identification of the issue in some cases. Yeah, Mystic is coming soon. Not yet.
So I have a quick question. You guys are talking about coding stuff, and I wrote it on my post-it here, and I drew a picture. What is Flutter? Because I hear you guys. Yeah.
Oh.
What is Flutter? Tell me, boys.
Dennis question. Go for it, buddy.
Oh boy.
So they're actually, so this is a perfect example, by the way, where things can cross various domains a little bit, right? So we were just talking about, secrets and whatnot, and how that could lead to the exposure of, like, if you have secrets to, let's say, an AWS platform or an Azure platform or something like that, now you're talking about, cascading compromise to cloud infrastructure, right? Well, Dennis was talking a little bit about remote code execution, right? There's also breaking into containers rather than conventional server infrastructure. But Avery, you know a bit about Flutter. You heard about Flutter here. Dennis, why don't you tell us a little bit about Flutter and where that's used and how it relates to
this is you, Dennis.
web apps?
This is you. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Well, to answer the question on Flutter, yeah. So Flutter, for those who aren't familiar, Flutter is it's a cross-platform application development library. So it allows you to develop applications that work for iOS or Android, either platform, while keeping the code base down. So you don't have to have a Java code base and a Swift code base. It's all one. So to Christian's point, as far as why automated tools may have trouble finding secrets. One great example is Flutter applications, because what can happen is the way that Flutter works is essentially it takes the code you write and it compiles it into a language that both Android and iOS can understand through platform-specific interpreters. So what happens as a result of that is that if you hard code a credential inside of the Flutter code, once it gets compiled down into that binary, it's not in a traditional format. It's not going to be in like a JSON file or an XML file. It's not going to be in any sort of source code. It's not going to be picked up. I think in some cases, we've done automated scanning using tools like MobSF against Flutter applications, and they haven't picked up secrets. And the primary reason is because it embeds it into that compiled cross-platform binary blob. Ideally, tools like Secret Searcher and Secret Scanner and Mystic, or they're going to flag it. But again, some of the issues you have is just the vast quantity of results. But it shows a good point why you can't entirely trust automated tools to do all the work for you. There is some human component necessary.
So many false positives.
I think that very much relates to what we see, even though we're talking, that was very kind of like mobile specific, right? But the element of conventional technologies, conventional approaches changing over time, right? So, Flutter's a new approach that a lot of developers are leveraging and utilizing, that us as security architects and as pen testers need to adapt to and understand, right? And I think, Travis, you've done quite a bit of pen testing where you've seen kind of both web applications that are architected in a, when I say conventional or in a traditional sense, like 10 years old type of traditional, right? With Microsoft centric IIS, ASP.NET sites, right? And then seeing on the other side, sites that are a little bit more modern now, leveraging things like React.js, AngularJS, and whatnot. why don't you talk a little bit about like when a new web app pen tester is encountering something like, Microsoft IS versus an Angular app, how they might approach those two things differently in the web app pen testing process.
Well, it's really that's an area where it is kind of similar in the methodology sense to what you would think about with a traditional network pen test, right? If you're doing the traditional pen testing, you're going to look at the infrastructure, the type of infrastructure, figure out the platform enumeration, the CPE, and then go into CVEs after that. You'll do the same thing with web apps. There's going to be different things that you might be able to look at if it's an IIS server and if it's using some ASP.NET from 2003, which I saw just a few weeks ago, or if it is something really modern, maybe using React.js or something else similar to that. So it's in the same sense, you're doing that fingerprinting, that enumeration. You're just focusing on the application, the server, maybe the underlying APIs, as opposed to doing it on a massive scope. But fundamentally, it's the same concept. You need to understand what you're targeting before you start launching attacks at it.
I will say there's a little bit of an interesting approach of approaching single page applications compared to like more conventional ones. And I find this actually a great question when thinking about single page applications, which are a bit more quirky, Dennis. Dennis, what's your favorite browser extension you like to use alongside like something like Burp Suite? I know that you like to tamper with a lot of client side code and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Tamper Monkey, yes.
Tamper
Tamper Monkey, yes. I love Tamper Monkey. So with especially, yeah, with clients, so with client side code, which is becoming more prevalent in single page applications, like things like React.js or applications that are more dynamic. Tamper Monkey is definitely a useful tool. If there are protections, for instance, that are in place that may try to prevent you from debugging or modifying something on the page in a way that it doesn't want you to, Tamper Monkey is a great tool that you can actually leverage to disable those protections. Now, granted, you need to know some JavaScript to fiddle with the bits here and there, but if you're going to be tampering in the level of single page applications and needing to modify that stuff, you probably already know enough to draft up some JavaScript at that point.
Awesome. Look at that. That was spot on. That's almost like I had somebody purposely salt the comments with good questions or something like that. But so Holman, as somebody as the man who's known for having a new cybersecurity question every single day on LinkedIn, I know that you're always packed full of learning resources, that kind of stuff. And I know that you've taken the opportunity of going beyond also what the folks behind Burp Suite have created for all their training content. What are some of the good labs that people might be able to look at, or some demo purposely vulnerable web apps that they could play with to kind of start to hone their skills or get a good feel for web app pen testing?
Absolutely. That's one of the harder things out there. When you're first starting, you have, hack the box, try hack me with network things. In my journey, I found a bunch of different apps that I enjoyed testing and learned quite a bit on. One, of course, everyone has to know is the standard OWASP Juice Shop. Everyone knows that one, But there are some ones that are really oddly specific, like bank applications. There's Altoro Mutual, excuse me, Altoro Mutual. There's Bank Zero out there, Zero Bank. And in the chat, I'll go back and I'll post these in our LinkedIn chat as well, unless someone is. Oh, there we go. We already did. Yep. So we have those. There is Hackazon, which is really good. There's Google Gruyere. Everyone who likes cheese, right? That's their old joke. But yeah. So and there's of course WebGoat. There's I think my favorite two though are Altero Mutual and Zero Web App Bank, because it simulates actual banking applications, which is pretty hot right now, honestly. The last 2 or 3 years. So, and what's cool about these is they're chock full of the big ones, right? The cross-site scripting, the SQLI, all that stuff. But there's also, these ones also contain the more important foundational beginning ones of looking for headers, right? Looking for content security policies, things of that nature, things that you need to do as an unauthenticated user first, and poke around the web app to get a real good feel of the attack surface of it, right? Because a lot of things that some of these other training apps like Burp Suite, things like that, they don't go over like unauthenticated things, So that's a major part in web app, is to play around with it, unauthenticated and authenticated, see the differences, right? Are sessions changing before you log in? Is there session fixation, right? That's one where your session cookies don't change upon login. These are all great apps to test those on. So that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. Very solid. Thank you for that. And actually, you know what? I think we have a little bit from when we previously did a Cyber Judo session on building home cybersecurity lab for folks. So I'm going to pop this here. And then, I'm going to just briefly show my screen. Let me see if I can do this correctly and not mess it up too badly. Okay. So I just want to check, team. Can you guys see my screen?
No.
No.
Not yet.
Okay, let's see here.
While you're doing that, Dennis, I drew this picture of you as a butterfly. See, there's your beard and your headphones.
You sure that's not Mike as well?
Okay. So I got it up here now. You guys can see this one? Okay,
Yep.
super. So if we go down just a little bit here, and so this is the whole guide about building an internal lab. By the way, highly recommend anyone who doesn't have a lab already. This is one of the fantastic guides that will help you guide you towards what type of lab or environment's best for you. Not telling you, go use VirtualBox or go use VMware ESXi or go use this, but here are all the different types of options, different hardware solutions, all that kind of stuff. But some of the different virtual machines that you guys can kind of deploy, like OWASP Juice Shop and the damn vulnerable Linux and all that kind of stuff. I would say one of my favorite resources that tends to go under the radar is a lot of the fantastic OWASP content. So everyone, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I do this to OWASP, standards." Like, what does that mean? OWASP is a foundation. They have a lot of projects, right? And obviously, when we go to talk about like web app stuff, I always tell people like, yeah, you got OWASP Web Top 10, but like actually go through the entire OWASP Web Security Testing Guide. Actually go through the OWASP API Security Top 10. They don't have an API Security Testing Guide quite yet, at least to my knowledge. They also got API Security Top 10, right? And Serverless Top 10. But anywho, the big one that tends to go under the radar is the OWASP Security Knowledge Framework. This is fantastic for not just developers learning about security in the software development lifecycle and that kind of stuff, but also honing your pen testing expertise. So, Holman, you've been talking about like specific demo applications to kind of like work with and play with, which I think provides a really good like sense of like the feel of something that's kind of realistic. But maybe somebody is trying to be more like atomic with understanding a particular set of vulnerabilities or weaknesses. You can deploy the security knowledge framework to your own environment. And then what you could do is you can try doing some of these specific tests and get the ability to essentially, let's say we pull up, I don't know, one of these SQL injection ones. So we'll pull up, so let's do a SQL union select, right? So I hit start, and what it's going to do is it's going to start up a virtual machine for us, or actually a little Docker container that we can then browse to, right? And we can pull this up for our own little, basically, unit testing. So look at this. Here's a live demonstration that we can then start to perform testing on, right? And pulling it apart. And it has a complementary guide that's associated with it, all in the security knowledge framework. So kind of similar in a certain degree of like what you would get out of like Try Hack Me, but this is very, I think, not just open source, but quite aligned well to the OWASP framework. And again, I think in many ways has certain content that is not quite there yet on Try Hack Me. So I just want to call that one out for anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to deploy it or use it yet. And I'm just going to share that out here again. That is the OWASP Security Knowledge Framework. So learning not just about security and software development lifecycle principles and guides and all that kind of stuff, and helping you point you towards all the cheat sheets, right? But also allowing you to do that atomic testing and building your skills. So that being said, I know that we've hit on a lot of fantastic content so far. Travis, I know that Dennis has talked a little bit about some other areas like the labs and port swagger training. Is there anything outside of that that you might suggest for someone getting started in web app pen testing? Any other good resources, tips, tricks, tools, that kind of stuff?
Well, I shared it in the LinkedIn chat a while ago, and I'll put it in there again. But API Sec University has a lot of really good content, and you don't have to don't dive into API pen testing before you look at web apps, right? But they do also have some fundamental courses on there for free that are very good. They're not crazy long, and it's like, what is an API? Why are APIs there? How are they interacted? How do they interact? That's really, really important context, even if you're not at the point yet. And I'm just barely dabbling in API pen tests myself. But you need to have that understanding of what they are, why they're there, how they're used to grasp what the web application is doing when you open Burp Suite up. So I would also take a look at that.
Fantastic resource. I would say if I have one last one for folks, you got to use the sec list, guys. So you're looking for, SQL injection statements that you might be able to use, cross-site scripting statements you might be able to use, fuzzing that you want to have a fuzzing dictionaries, that kind of stuff. Tons and tons of fantastic lists here that you can then leverage in that process of, doing discovery and enumeration of a web application and all of its components. So all of that noted, one last big element that I get a lot. So very frequently when you talk about web app pen testing, you'll talk about, hey, you should implement these best practices here, like, input sanitization. You got to check your inputs, make sure you don't get hit with SQL injection attacks and all that kind of stuff. And I hear a lot from folks. They're like, okay, why should we go fix that? We got a WAF in place. Right? I got a WAF. WAF will fix that. It'll take care of that. Why do I got to have my developers go change that? Dennis, can you provide a little bit of breakdown of why folks who have that mindset might not necessarily be coming from the best place, understanding defense in depth, but also maybe some of the techniques that you know about or have employed for bypassing WAFs or web application firewalls?
Sure. Yeah, I would say as far as the problem with that approach, well, first off, I'm about to give some ways that you can bypass it. So already it's failed. The problem with that kind of thinking is that it's security, whether people like to admit it or not, is a multi-layer sort of thing. You have to have security everywhere, right? You be as secure as you can, control here, control here, control here as much as you can. That would be my opinion. There is some balance to be had, obviously, with usability. You don't want to make things where they you can't log out users every minute and have them verify their password. I mean, it's not practical to do that. You have to find a nice balance there. But at the same time, you can't just push all of your security on one appliance. You can't just say the WAF will do everything, because it won't. And there are ways to bypass it. So if I can just give some off the top of my head, if you have, for instance, JSON payloads, and it's not a very smart WAF, what you can do is you can Unicode encode the text, and you can just insert XSS content, and it'll walk right by it, because it's going to show up as /U0045 for every letter. It's not going to see it because it's going to be doing simple text matching. Some other ways that you can do it: if you can get the backend server's IP, if you can get it to leak the backend server's address, and the backend servers, you can connect to it. Well, that's terrible. That means you can just bypass the WAF entirely again. And that's a more direct approach, but there are quite a few ways that you can really just break it. Another way as well, if you have, for instance, let's say that there is a page that lets you update your first and last name. You could put in the first name field the first part of the payload, in the last name field the last part of the payload. When it puts it on the page side by side, you've created a full payload, and it's bypassed the WAF because they're separate. A WAF really, it's one component. I'm not going to say that WAFs are useless. WAFs do have their use, and they do protect. But at the same time, they don't protect against everything. And so security is an in-depth approach. You have to be secure on as many layers as possible while maintaining a level of usability of the system. That would be my take.
I mean, to the thought process of somebody trying to run malware on a workstation, or let's say a malicious PowerShell script, right? All the time we encode it. We find different ways to encode it and obfuscate it, so it's more difficult to detect it with signature-based detection. WAFs are using signature-based detection. They're looking for various regular expressions. So just in the most conventional sense for folks out there, if you can encode something and continue to obfuscate it, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that by changing either the character set, right, or by mixing like the different uppercase, lowercase characters, changing something to Unicode, inserting various amount of line breaks. There's a lot of different ways to just take that general approach, but there's even just back in the day, there were some very simple techniques. They don't usually work anymore or anything like that, but like changing the origin header, changing the origin header to yeah. So you change it to localhost, right? 127.0.0.1, right? And the WAF's like, oh yeah, of course that's legit. That's from me. You know what I mean? Just let's go through. But at the end of the day, when someone inherently just trusts their WAF to take care of everything, one, it's a poor defense in depth approach because you're relying on one security control. But then two, I think that creates that false sense of security to what you were talking about earlier, Dennis, with request smuggling attacks, right? Because once you get past the WAF, right, there might be a certain element. Let's say the WAF is performing, it's acting as a proxy, right? So it might be, let's say, doing TLS and SSL binding or offloading, right? Now, when that goes downstream to the web app, right, and the web app doesn't have any security controls, and it's like, well, it's coming from the WAF, and if it came from the WAF is trusted, right? Now you have a path for HTTP or for various smuggling attacks, right? So I think that's just again a fantastic illustration of why more and more as organizations continue to grow, to continue to develop, and improve their security posture against sophisticated malicious actors, that they will need to actually practice defense in depth, not just preach about it. So to that, I know we're just about at time here. I know we've shared out a fantastic amount of content. I do want to thank all of you folks joining us here tonight for all the insights, for all the tips, for all the tricks. Avery, for asking fantastic questions from the perspective of somebody who's new to web app pen testing and looking to gain more insight. Really, again, it's been intriguing and insightful. I know next week is July 4th coming up, and that means that next Wednesday is July 5th. And I also know that people are going to have too much fun, and likely that means that we're not going to have Cyber Judo next week. So I just want to call for anybody who is watching tonight. No worries. We are going to take a brief hiatus next week to go enjoy our alcohol and firecrackers. But no worries. We will be right back the week after that. And after that, we will be talking a little bit more about, I believe it's building a cybersecurity program and some of the elements of that A to Z for small businesses. So it's going to be a really fun one. So everyone, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Have a fantastic one. Bye now.